they don't display those error codes. So typically when you're getting to some software like HD Guru has MHDD, and there's Victoria, and there's a couple of other tools out there that will actually display those diagnostics codes, when the sector is actually responding, and you can see that content. So you'll know, oh yes, I know this type of error that I have. And so basically my goal here was to try to acknowledge the fact that not everything just needs to be replaced. And ripping off a board isn't necessarily going to do you a lot of good in some cases if you don't know what you're looking for. So
Right.
it's all about understanding these basics.
Yeah, this is great. It's going to help out a lot of people. I mean,
Thank
it is because problem is when guys run into hard drives, they don't necessarily know what's wrong with them. I mean, there's some very obvious symptoms, like you have on here the flow chart. You hear noises scraping, for example. Well, okay, well, what exactly does that mean? So the flow chart
Right.
at least directs you to the right place and gives you the right steps what to do. Man, this is really cool. I like.
Right. I mean, most of the time these days, some of the biggest things I run into are two things. One is that obviously the new Seagate hard drives that are 7211 and above, 7212, that those have firmware problems, and those have things that exhibit a problem that looks similar to a board problem or head problem, but may not be a board problem or head problem just because of these, particular firmware problems. And almost all drives, you could open the lid and look at something, so if you heard a scraping noise or there was something else, you could open the drive and you could look at it and you would know, what your condition is. Basically, is the platter scratch, the head damage, except for Western Digital hard drives. Western Digitals have a screw that's mounted to the head assembly, and when you remove this screw, it causes the head to wobble back and forth, and it basically causes an alignment problem. And now you can no longer tell whether or not you had a board problem or some other problem that was unrelated to this particular problem just because you've had a screw that you've removed. So I'm trying to at least make sure people understand. I've done this in some other talks and pushed the other information, but don't remove the screw in the lid of a Western Digital drive. Anything else you can look at, just not that one.
Yeah, we talked about that before. That's one screw could just mess up the whole works.
Right, exactly. So that's in the flow chart basically. That's some of the content that basically like, stop here. You can go in a different direction. Or, there are times obviously that everything's not do it yourself, or if you're going to do it yourself, it's going to require some equipment that may be more expensive than you want to use
Right,
yourself. So,
right.
but I've progressively gotten more and more people who are interested in doing data recovery as a business or a lifestyle. And so from that perspective, teaching the classes and going down that path, there are some do-it-yourselfers out there who are being creative in their processes of building stuff and kind of innovation. I've seen, more innovation than usual from that perspective.
Hmm.
So I'm trying to help those people out now as well. The people who want to learn it, even it goes as far as, FBI, CIA, or a couple of other people that have been in my class from that perspective, that there may be content that they want to learn, and they may have the money to buy certain tools, but they need to know which ones they are and why you want to buy this tool.
Right. No, it's an expensive, undertaking to really get these things fixed. Like to be able to fix them, no matter what the problem is, it could cost some bucks. I mean, I've seen the equipment that you use, so any guerrilla methods would be, great if they're dependable and work.
Right. Again, it's all about the knowledge. It's all about knowing what you have to do at that particular juncture without making a mistake. And that's typically where things go wrong with hard drives is you're taking something that's complex. If your car didn't start one day, a lot of people would just say, "Oh, let's go rip out a carburetor," or if the car even has a carburetor anymore. But but you get the point. It's they're not just going to rip parts off and replace them. So basically, I'm just trying to, not that ripping parts off and replacing them might work in some cases. There are some boards and some drives that do work with that,
Right.
but it does help to have a better knowledge of which ones those are and where you're going to stand once you actually do the rebuild.
Absolutely. It's great stuff.
Thank you.
Well,
So,
what else did you
well,
want to go over?
well, the next thing I did was basically ShmooCon, basically going to ShmooCon. It's in Washington, D.C. And so this particular talk that I did at ShmooCon, which I believe you have some of my animations you can kind of show, and I can kind of, hit that from that perspective and show some of the basics.
Sure.
Uh, you know, we had a tool that we could use to remove platters when we had a frozen motor. So basically, when the spindle locks up, we had a tool that's called an HPE, so it's a hard disk platter extractor. And we could take these platters and we could remove them from a drive and put them on another drive, another motor. And so that's kind of where we're starting with this, is that this tool no longer works on certain new hard drives that we have. There's now these spacers, these black spacers that basically sit around the outside edges of the platters, and it stops us from using this tool. And there wasn't a lot of easy ways to get around this. There wasn't a lot of easy ways where we could, cut these off. At one time when they were plastic, you could kind of use like a hot wire, cut them off and do something else with it. But not anymore. Basically now we're dealing with some stuff that might be, excuse me, that we might have metal ones that we're going to have to deal with. So these metal ones, the next slide shows metal ones.
Is that it there?
No, that particular one's plastic. That one right there, the silver ones, those are metal. And so we can no longer just cut those off and continue on trying to rebuild the drive. So we've had to find a new way to remove these without doing any other damage to either the platters, the heads, or the drive in order to get to at this point, basically what we're looking at is there's bearings inside the drive. And these particular ones are called fluid dynamic bearings. And we can replace that particular core of the bearings, and then the platters will be able to spin and we'll be able to get the job done. However, you can't take off each platter individually because they're sequenced and they're aligned with the platters below them.
All right.
So if we could have taken them off one at a time, that would be an easy job. You take off the top one, then you take off the spacer that's in between it, then you take off the next platter, and so on and so on.
Right.
So since we can't do this, we have to figure out a way to remove those platters, keeping them in line, and popping this other piece out.
You're keeping them in line you have to still do it one at a time, but you got to keep them in line.
No, now you will remove the entire set together.
Uh-huh.
So now the hard disk platter extractor that we had before also did that. It removed them all together, kept them bound together. The difference is it took the platters off the spindle. In this particular case, we're going to take the spindle off of the bearings, and we're going to replace the bearings. So if you progress, you'll see that this is what our goal is now. This device that's sitting in the middle is basically what we're looking at here is a picture of the top of the spindle, and it's being surrounded by the fluid dynamic bearings, which are encased in basically a kind of like a metal sheath, and there's a pole that basically goes up through the bottom of it. So this is basically the patent for this submission. And in the middle, you can see that there's these grooves that go around in the middle around the sheath that's around the pole. And these grooves are very, very important for fluid dynamic bearings. There's a difference between fluid bearings and fluid dynamic bearings. And one of those items is that the fluid bearings, basically whatever you have is submerged in this fluid, and that the fluid basically is there all the time. In fluid dynamic bearings, you have a situation where the fluid sits in another location and it's basically sucked up into the sheath itself and then surrounds the pole in order to keep the pole going. So you have to have your fluid bearings around your pole.
Huh.
So if you progress a little bit out, on the slides, basically you can see this is the goal. This silver item with the post through the middle is what we're getting to. So for the people who don't necessarily see slides or something like that, you can go to a website and see them. But basically there's this pole that goes through the middle of a cylinder, and this pole is basically what is lubricated internally. And this is basically the device that we're looking for. Now, my goal for this particular talk, there are tools that are out there. I've seen several tools, and they're typically fairly expensive, several thousands of dollars, if not greater than that. I've seen them as high as $6,000 to $10,000 for tools to remove the bearings. And my problem with this is that removing the bearings is one of kind of the smallest piece of one of the jobs that we have. And I'm not trying to diminish its importance here because it's a very difficult task, but it doesn't solve any of our other problems. It doesn't solve our head problems or anything else that we already have, our alignment issues. We still have to do all that work ourselves, just like we did before. And so we had a very inexpensive piece to remove the platters, and this particular 6,000 or higher tool would basically remove, the cost that we had of the smaller, least expensive tool. So now it becomes the most expensive device in our arsenal.
Yeah, but Scott, so you're basically trying to pull that pole out of this bearing and you need a $6,000 tool to do that.
No, what you're looking at is the entire set. That's the bearing.
Okay.
That you're not trying to pull the pole out of it. This particular container, basically, with the pole going up through it, is the bearing.
I see.
And that's what we're trying to remove from inside of the
drive.
sheet that's around it. Basically, we have a spindle that sits over it that basically the platters are mounted to. And so this piece is captured between the solid component of the base of your hard drive when you flip it over and you see a little hole that's a circle, and the top. And I have pictures of it coming up, but basically that's what we're looking at.
Gotcha.
Is that this piece is captured between the base of the metal of your drive and the spindle component where the platters are actually mounted to.
Gotcha.
And we're going to need to remove this piece and replace it, and then realign everything, put it all back in.
Okay. You want me to hit the next? You direct me with the next slides.
Yeah,
here.
go ahead. Yeah. So basically, my talk at ShmooCon was basically about going through how the bearings work, because I do a little bit more on the education part. You can keep hitting play, basically. So I'm trying to show what the inside of this particular cylinder looks like. And so I'm trying to do an educational component so people understand why it's locking up. Now, there's this pole that basically goes through the middle of the cylinder, and underneath it there's a small ring of copper that's mounted to this pole, and then there's a cap on the bottom to hold it in. And so that's basically where the fluid is sitting. And so once it starts to spin up, then the fluid is moved up the post by some grooves that are cut in a particular pattern inside of the cylinder. So you can advance. So this is what it basically looks like inside. Once I break this apart, the copper piece, the bottom, and basically I tore this whole one up. I beat the crap out of this one to get it out.
Looks
So the post this was actually frozen. You could not move this post in the middle. This is what actually allows the platters to spin. And so what's basically happening is that some of the fluid is not being distributed, or it's overheating in certain places, causing it to lock up, which actually then kind of grips it inside of the cylinder. You can hit advance. So this kind of horrible slide that you're looking at was basically to show that prior to like 2005 or so, most of the drives had ball bearings in them.
Mm-hmm.
And basically you can see the two balls at the top slide, the two pink dots that are in pairs on the bottom and the top.
Right.
And that those pink balls, basically there's a problem with bearings. And bearings, as these balls are spinning around in a track that basically goes around the device, it allows the thing to spin. Well, the problem with bearings is that they're kind of somewhat oblong, or as they heat up, they change shape, and you start having all kinds of problems. So people have seen seized motors before with bearings. And so the whole point is to get away from bearings and move to fluid dynamic bearings, because they're faster, they support more speed, and they have a little bit better chance of not heating up and doing some of the same things that the ball bearings themselves did. So that's basically a problem. The product that basically IBM was showing on the bottom, which is the fluid dynamic bearings themselves. You can advance.
Okay.
And so I have an animation that's basically showing a cutaway of how this post in the center of the cylinder of the fluid dynamic bearings can overheat, and then it basically seizes. So this cutaway, basically it'll just turn redder and redder until basically the post expands to the point that it actually seizes inside of the drive. Advance.
And that's because of fluid not getting to it properly?
Yes, it can be for a couple of things. These grooves right here, where you're actually looking at this particular picture, this one actually shows some grooves that are cut inside the cylinder. And so what happens is fluid dynamic bearings has a lot of math behind it, behind how these grooves work, how the oil itself is actually going to be moving up the shaft so that it actually creates amount of pressure. And I kind of equate it to the same thing as like an egg, that if you applied pressure, it's equal amounts of pressure all the way around the egg, that it basically won't crack, because you create enough pressure inside the egg equally in all the positions that it doesn't crack. And that's basically what's looking at here in this post, is basically that the fluid dynamic bearings, when they're equally distributed, it actually is lubricating and withstanding the pressure. But in the next slide, if you look at the next slide, you can see these grooves that are cut that basically cause the fluid to move. And then as it's rotating, It kind of makes a wormhole or whatever you want to call it, a whirlpool as it goes up the shaft and keeps it